Hello, everybody. Grant Hunter here for another Product Growth Leaders Conversations. Steve, gosh, December is a time of year where there's a whole bunch of stuff going on. People seem to jam a lot of stuff into December. We're trying to put our annual plans on place. We always have like these last minute releases we want to do. And I looked through all the logs and we have never talked about setting objectives. Setting annual objectives, or maybe we from some of the answers, maybe we cut out that middle word annual. But I thought it might be an interesting time to talk about setting objectives. I remember both as an individual contributor, as a product leader, it always seemed to bleed from November into December into January and February and March as we did it. And, I just thought it might be an interesting conversation since we're at that time of year where hopefully people are thinking about it, or at a minimum, they're getting prepared for being judged against the objectives they set a year ago when they go through their review in the beginning of the year. So, any thoughts before we kick off on setting annual objectives, or just the idea of objectives?
It is funny. It's like looking back a year ago, like, what did we have objectives? What were they? Have I gotten anywhere close to them? And years ago, I had a situation where I had turned in an 18 million number for my product. And my boss said, "Oh, I think you're sandbagging. I think you can do 40 million, because, I used a spreadsheet." And the following year, I was no longer there at my choice. And I called the product manager who replaced me. And I said, "How'd you do this year?" And she said, "We did 18.3. And I didn't get my bonus because some jackass turned in a $40 million number." And I'm like, "Well, I was kind of that jackass, but you still work for that jackass."
Well, it'll be an interesting conversation because I really enjoyed some of the insight that came from the answers to our questions in our poll. And
Cool.
so let's get going and start talking about our Monday question. What are the keys to developing impactful annual objectives for your team? May, you talked about how this whole process starts 3 or 4 months before the year end, and we tend to associate finance and growth projections and strategy with this. Talk to me about where you see how we should be doing these objectives.
So there's a lot of things that are attached to this idea of annual objectives. But if you think about the reason why we do it, there's strategic alignment, but then there's also making sure your team gets funded. And that's the finance portion. And really,
Yep.
that's probably the most important part of it all. But in order to get the finance projections, you need to know what you're doing. You need to have a strategy for your team to follow, and also so that your team knows what they're doing too. And so you could get something done, right? Like that's the whole point behind all of this. It's like, let's figure out what we're doing and then who's doing it. And then maybe if you're lucky, how are we doing it? So I think that if we think about what it is that we're trying to accomplish, there's, you've been writing a lot about this like in the last couple of weeks. It's the upward pressures and the downward pressures when you are a product leader, like trying to figure out what you're doing across the company, what are you doing at the product level. And I think like when you talk about objectives at that scale, if you do it every year, there's a lot of pressure for you to get it right. So we spend this stupid amount of time trying to get it right once a year so we do not change it for the rest of the year, whereas our markets change every 6 months. Our targets change probably more than every 6 months, because like this is the nature of the business. Unless if you're in hardware, it's a little different. But like in software, like our we're 6 to 12 months away from anyone catching up to us or creating a new niche. And if a chat gpt comes out, like you might as well throw your product out sometimes, right? So I think it's worthwhile to say, like, if we tie ourselves into an annual objective planning cycle, we could be stuck. Like it's so hard to change when you tell everyone, okay, we're going to do this every 12 months, and then 5 months in you say, well, we have no market. The market's
Right.
gone.
and I've been there where, I had sort of like Steve's, like there was a stretch goal put on my head and the market's changed and we couldn't even hit that 18. It's tough, but you made a really good, interesting point. I never thought about this link between the objectives we're setting and the budget we're requesting for our team, for the financial planning aspect of it.
Yeah,
Uh,
and I think it's like really thinking about, if you have a target you want to hit and you can't do it with your current team, say in order to hit this target, you need to basically create a brand new AI team from scratch. Like that costs money to hire up. You need to write up that plan. You need to say, this is why AI is important to whatever product we're building, and therefore we need like $5 million to spin up this team. If, it seems like a relatively conservative estimate even. So, and that's a
wait,
recurring cost, right?
yeah, and it takes, and that sort of was where that middle out concept you were talking about from my article on my post on LinkedIn. But the other thing that really hit me was this idea of the company needs to be able to change faster than annually, even though we tend to plan in annual cycles. Clifton Gilly had posted a nice thing on LinkedIn about how one of the biggest problems we face is, as agile as we want to be, the reality is most companies do annual planning. And if you don't sort of match your planning cycles with your delivery cycles, or at least have some sort of connection to it of how you evolve it and change it, it's going to be tough. I think that's the same for annual objectives. Elliot just said it seems like waterfall in the chat, and May and I were just having some conversations with a friend, former client, about his use of the Hoshin Conry system, which I thought was very top down, but the way he talked about it, it made it seem like if you empower people, it could be interesting. It might be interesting there. But yeah, I'll say Paul Hatala, the Iron Sheik, Paul Hatala, came with annual planning seems so waterfall, doesn't it? Even a relatively slow moving industry, I maintain that a quarterly cadence evaluating objectives. So talk to me about breaking it down, your ideas on annual versus quarterly, and how do we make that happen?
So we had a fun cycle this year, and strangely, we're a April to March company, but somehow our planning starts in like September and October. So it seems like we take a half year to figure it out, and then a half year to do things, and then start over again. But
Sorry, go ahead.
So we have, on one hand, we have about 3 years of firm orders in hand, and we'll dicker over should year 2026 look like this, or 1% more, 1% less, and so that's what our annual planning looks like now. But within our division, what I've been doing is taking what have we learned from a product and marketing standpoint, what have we learned from a sales and engineering standpoint, and what outcomes can we still influence, and how are we going to measure those, and what needs to be true to make that happen. So regardless of what goes on the magic piece of paper that no one's going to look at until next September, I just go ahead and start creating the future that we need to have instead. So I sort of paraphrasing Steve, it's the individual heroics instead of the vast array of infrastructure that we've built up is how things are actually going to get done.
Awesome. I love it. Clay, you talked about review and redone from the top down, mission, vision, strategy, update, set new objectives. Talk me through your thoughts.
I haven't done this, I think, as much as you guys have. And I do take, May had a response on that. She's like, you should be looking at all times. And that's what I did with my company. But I felt like at bigger companies, maybe they don't do it continuously. I just thought it was a good time to start from scratch, and work your way all the way from make sure that we actually are doing a real strategy, to reference the Good Strategy, Bad Strategy book.
Yep. So in your mind, it starts with making sure we have reevaluated and have that good strategy, which maybe is one of the problems people have with annual objectives, is because in our conversations with product leaders, I feel like at least a third to half don't feel like they have a good corporate strategy, have a defined corporate strategy for them to work with, let alone And there's got to be some level of cascading, right? Where if we're going to, and this is sort of where Hoshin Kassen comes in, right? How Hoshin Kanri comes in. How do you do that in a non-command and control way? Maybe have that sort of cascade of hierarchies. But that's where I always thought, how do we take 5 core objectives for the company and roll them into objectives for 200 different people in different departments? It always seemed like a interesting approach to that.
Well,
Calvin,
it also,
you said, oh, go ahead.
Just one last thought. It also seems like a good opportunity to, if your company doesn't actually have a strategy, and a lot of times they don't, to at least nudge it closer to being a real strategy and to say, hey, while we're at it, let's think about what a strategy is,
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, Steve, how everything can roll back to, do we have a strategy?
Yeah, one of my favorite instructors was in front of a room, and she said, well, you can't really do marketing if you don't have a product strategy. And everybody put their heads on their desks and started banging their heads. They're like, oh, shoot, we don't have a strategy. And, you look around a room and it's like 30 people and all of them are saying, oh my gosh, we have no strategy. So apparently alignment on strategy is a big deal.
Yeah. And I think, I guess ideally, that's what we want when we're doing annual objectives. We need to understand for ourselves and for our team members, what are the other things they should be focusing on to help us move that ball, right? To get closer to that strategy we're working on. Calvin, you said yes and added some additional things about quantifiable firm objectives.
Yeah, I mean, and to the point that you just made about having those having those strategies and putting a strategy in place. I said once you drop one level down to some of the sub strategies, the tactics. I mean, at some point we need to know, did we hit them or did we not? Did we make 18 million or did we make 40 million or did we not? So it's can't be kind of this fuzzy nebulous thing, but really, did we do it? How do we know when we get there? Did we do X or Y or Z? And being able to say, yes, we did, or no, we didn't.
No, I completely agree. And I don't want to derail this, but I may want to get into it still in this first question. This idea of pushing objectives on people versus letting people set their own objectives. I didn't ask that. I don't have that as a question coming up. But I facilitated on Wednesday a product leadership council, and we were talking about alignment, centralized versus decentralized, and alignment and empowerment and these types of things. And it's like, how often have I been in a situation where my objectives were handed to me, right? I wasn't any part of figuring out what they should be, but they were handed down to me, versus a world, which is sort of a top-down power structure type thing, versus a world where boundary conditions and of the strategy were handed to me, and I was able to identify what I thought the right objective. Obviously, there's going to be a conversation there with your leader to figure it out, but I don't want to get there yet, but I may come back to that. I just was something in my head with what you said, Calvin, that made me think about that. And maybe this sort of ties to Richard's. The key is to define them enough to get senior leadership to buy in, but vague enough to account for the changes required as you learn new information throughout the year. I mean, I guess that's the sweet spot. That's the Goldilocks, right?
Right.
Right.
Right. I mean, the goal is, right, tell leadership what problems you need to solve this year. Right. But don't tell them how you're going to do it. Don't tell them what you're going to put in place to solve it, because that boxes you in to just doing that. And as you do your discovery, you're going to find out that whatever your first instinct was probably the wrong approach. So just talk about the problems you want to solve, the market that you can gain if you solve those problems. Get the buy-in
that sounds an awful lot like road mapping.
It does. Right? Because isn't that what everything is? A roadmap? Right? You've got your strategic priority roadmap. You've got your features that you're working on roadmap. Right? Everything bubbles down to, or rolls down to different roadmaps. Right? But you want your teams to be able to look at what problem they need to solve for it and then figure out what's the best way to do it.
No, if only I worked in companies where the senior leadership would go for vague.
Well, right, it's vague, and then, right, you're not. Here's an example, right? We are dealing with, Google deprecating third-party cookies, sometime in 2024, right? What the solution may be for that we're going to work on, it could be anything from a single sign-on system. It could be adopting a new ID from whatever standard bubbles to the top, to working with our partners to be able to read their first-party cookies, right? It could be any number of things. What senior leadership needs buy-in for is we're going to focus on a solution that allows us to continue at X level with this deprecation of third-party cookies.
Which, in a sense, this tie between annual objectives for the company, our revenue growth, profitability, being tied to annual objectives, almost it doesn't allow you to focus on the outcomes that are the right things to be focused on, because they're trying to tie you to that number versus tie you to what actions you need to take.
Is that right? That number, I ignore it because it's always handed down to me. Right, I'm told you need to grow from 18 million to 40 million this year. Yeah. Like, you know what? I'm going to focus on getting these problems solved for the biggest groups and see how close we get to that, because I had no say in that number.
Yeah, I once was a P&L leader at a really, really, really big industrial conglomerate, and their whole model for what our number should be the next year was you needed to have double-digit growth on your operating income. And they didn't care if you had a one-time favorable. We had a lawsuit that we had reserves set aside for that we won. And all of a sudden our operating income went up by literally like 25-50% compared to where it normally would be. And then they said, that's the new bar that you started from. And all of a sudden, maybe we understand why that company is no longer as big of a conglomerate as they used to be. If all they're doing is, number based versus market and outcome based. I actually, Richard, you got me thinking a lot about that. I sort of, how do we make that switch? I'm going to ruminate on this. Maybe I'll come back to you. Elliot, you gave a nice list of where do successful annual plans come from, and so how to help people with building their objectives.
Yes, sir. Yeah, I was kind of thinking about what was really important. Really, it just comes down to understanding where the company is supposed to be going. We talked about this just a little bit. It was the idea of, should the company be moving in this direction? Do we know where we want to go? And given that, where do the products, the divisions, the product lines themselves actually fit in there? And then make sure that everyone is aligned there. And one of the big things is really understanding where there's going to be friction or where there's going to be conflict as well, and kind of address those up front. Basically, the known problems that are going to be out there. If you can address the knowns, then the unknowns are going to be easier to manage because you have kind of figured those other things out. Really, it's just an opportunity for true alignment in the intermediate term when you think about the 1 year approach. But to the point that we've kind of harped on a little bit, we can't just say this is where we want to be at the end of the year and then it's locked in. That's a path to ruin.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in our poll. But it's, I guess this is why management's not easy, right? If it was easy, we wouldn't be having these conversations. Eric, love to get your thoughts. Keys to developing impactful annual objectives for you and your team.
I'll follow on Richard a bit here, because I've had the good fortune of working in an environment where I could really kind of create that consensus among my community of stakeholders and customers. And I could then calibrate continually, if you will, out of necessity. So we had a big annual ceremony. I'll just kind of sum it up quickly. HR SaaS was the business. We do a big offering a strategy ceremony. I'd have to make sure I got a lot of support behind my plan, articulate a 3 mile, I won't curse, 3 mile, 3 year horizon, shot in the dark, right, of priorities to align with other major shifting objectives across the portfolio, but then come back to just really managing what everybody is going to accept as the most important in the near-term horizon that I could drive very well. But then after all of that, after approval, after executive review, then the surprises come into play with, well, we've decided after everybody else's plan has been reviewed that we're going to shift some of your team over here, over there. So you lose control of that fairly quickly, then recalibrate all the time. So it was exciting to get something together, to have something to show at the customer conference at the end of Q3. But then, of course, you've got to be ready to change and adapt.
Yeah, and it's so hard because I think we get constraints put us on by HR and leadership of what they want us to be doing versus maybe what to fit within their systems and their needs versus what would really actually be the best stuff for us in product and the product organization for how do we drive
And maybe
that.
I could cheat a little bit by definition of my product, which was HR onboarding. So I did compliance and federal forms and things like that. So I always had wild cards in there. So I would always have to be agile, and people would be understanding of having to shift to a new I-9 or something like that. So, I was a little bit expected of needing to be flexible.
I remember a leader telling me, when you're set to a goal, 20 million is what your target is. I don't care if something changes. You still just need to figure out how to get back to 20 million. And again, are we doing the right things or I almost feel like this is short-sighted or not seeing the forest for the trees sometimes when we do these types of things. Thank you, Eric. Danny, your thoughts?
Hello, everybody. So I love everything that everybody's talked about up to this point. I want to give a little bit of a platform to something that often gets overshadowed or overlooked when we're doing annual planning, and that's professional development and actually enhancing your team's, knowledge, understanding, and education. We're asked to solve a lot of really difficult problems. We're asked to hit some pretty lofty goals and targets. If your team is more well-equipped, if your team is prepared, they can help solve those things. They can help make that annual planning or quarterly review process much more powerful by having extra brain power. So the reason I mention this is because I have very few times seen product teams actually stub in professional development, training, or education for their own team members. Usually we're just very much focused on features, capabilities, new product, revamping existing product, and we kind of forget about the people that make that all happen. So I just wanted to give that little additional spin or bring in that other perspective.
Yeah, definitely. I appreciate that. And I was wondering if you may have looked ahead in my slide deck because I've got a question about sort of how do we balance the business and personal aspects of it, and I think professional development would fit into that personal aspects of it. I'm going off on a different track just because of the chat. And how different are annual objectives, like for an employee evaluation? We set our objectives maybe for bonus and evaluation from OKRs. They both have objective in it. I tend to think of objective OKRs at a very initiative level, but can you do OKRs at the individual level? And I'm going to go to May because she's the one who brought up OKRs in the chat.
I'm not quite sure what the question is.
So think of the annual objectives that are put on us as part of our employee review process and bonusing and that type of stuff. How similar or different should they be from an OKR itself? Can an OKR be used for that? Or I always tend to think of OKRs as an initiative level.
So absolutely not. OKRs are not an individual metric. OKRs
Okay.
are for teams. All right. I feel very, very, very strongly towards this because it's the idea of an OKR is that you set a target for your team to work towards. It is a shorter term focus that you think is the most important thing to do, or the most important metric to push to really drive business results, right? That's how I see OKRs. When you talk about annual personnel reviews, employee reviews, first of all, those also shouldn't be annual. They're annual because we never do them, and that's the way you force people to do it. If you want your people to actually do work, you need to be there for them, and they need to understand what it is that you want them to do. So again, like, should any of this be annual? Like, it's annual because nobody does it. It's annual because we're forced to do this alignment because nobody actually does it. Nobody does planning around it. Nobody creates a structure around it. But all of these things need to change on more than an annual basis. And whatever you set as the thing that you must do becomes like the structure that you are embedded in. And when you need to do things off cycle, it's really, really, really hard. I remember when I first joined a huge software company, it took them a year to give me a promotion because I just missed the promotion cycle.
And you
And
had to wait for the next window.
yes, yes. And they're like, "Oh, we can push you up in the off cycle round, or we can push you off cycle, and the off cycle round is 7 months from now." They
That's
only did it twice
ridiculous.
a year.
So is it just me, or is it that finance is dictating the schedule because they have to report annual revenue and income for, and so because of our annual requirements for tax or whatever stock, if you're public, everything is forced to a 1 year cycle versus more agile, flexible cycle we could do. This
I
is a
mean, like,
hypothetical.
if you're constantly doing work on strategy, on like how your people are doing, and talking through and creating alignment, and have a consistent strategy that might need to shift every now and then, but you do this, all you have to do is report on an annual basis. That's what they care about. They want that report. But sometimes, like, if you are at the C-suite, like, you're gonna need to give updates to the board members on a quarterly basis anyways, right? Like,
Yeah.
you're gonna need to provide all these updates. So like, if you're doing it annually, you still need to do it quarterly anyway. So
No, I get that. Danny.
I guess tangential to that, sometimes there aren't like sometimes it's the reverse where there isn't an annual like business strategy. There aren't MBOs, there aren't OKRs defined by the organization, but your team can still do that independently, right?
Yeah.
We can still set goalposts for however we want to improve, however we want to progress. I think it's a funny conversation, right? Because how often does the business go back and reset their initial strategy, right? And how often do we know that that's actually happening? So at the end of the day, I'm trying to say, like, does it really matter what we're setting if we're not like reviewing it and revisiting it and course correcting?
That lovely, the company forecasts, but they don't change your objectives that are based on the original forecast.
Right. Now, I mean, it happens a lot. They're like,
it does a ton.
this activity, let's write it in stone. Everybody must adhere to this. 4 months in, 2 quarters into the year, everything has changed. They've, scrapped a bunch of initiatives that were tied back to some of those original pillars, and nobody goes back and updates the strat, right? It's still set in stone. People are still under the impression that we're marching forward. I think that's where it gets really confusing for a lot of employees at organizations.
Yeah, I worked at one company where there were 2 sets of projections, one for the executives' bonuses and one for everybody else. That's not alignment, I guess. Steve, any last thoughts before we move to the poll?
Well, I just posted it in the chat, but I'll repeat it here. The 4th key idea from the Agile Manifesto is responding to change over following a plan. And, if you're in a changing environment, you need to be open to changing the plan and being realistic.
Yeah, no, I totally get that. Well, we've been talking about this a lot, and let me pin myself so people can see this. We did a poll. I was a little belated. It didn't come out until yesterday, but we still got good response. How frequently should we be updating your objectives? No surprise, based on the conversation, nobody voted for annually as part of the company's annual process. And not really a surprise, nobody voted monthly or more frequently to keep focus. I was looking for an extra one. A few other, it depends, but quarterly through QBRs or similar to iterate on your objectives. And at whatever frequency your key focus initiatives shift, were the top two. Paul, I'm going to go to you. I believe you were a quarterly, correct?
I am, and it's largely because that's when I have substantial new learning to make new decisions.
Yeah.
And that's there's other organizations I've been in where that number might have magically been more or less, but at least for the world I'm in right now, it's a sustainable, predictable. People are looking for, hey, what's the Q4? I actually have a meeting right after this to go over with our marketing team. What's our Q4 is calendar Q1. So what are our objectives for the next quarter? Just to say, hey, here's what we learned. Hey, let's tweak this a little bit. Let's update this and see how that goes.
Yeah, no, I got it. Jason Weber said he voted for quarterly because it gets it on that calendar. So make sure you do it. May, you voted for the at whatever frequency. You said quarterly reviews, updated goals when necessary.
Yeah. So like, who are you reviewing with, right? That's the real big question. If you are doing a big review across like all the different teams, I think quarterly is reasonable because other teams are also shifting and you need to know what they're shifting to. It
Yeah.
doesn't need to be the whole company. It needs to be your leadership are aligned. However, when we are doing OKRs, it is really important within your product team to do a monthly OKR review, partly because it is a process of forcing you to think about whether or not you're hitting your objectives, what you're learning. Sharing those different contexts really helps build out that smaller team. So for me in my past, we've done monthly OKR reviews, we've done quarterly, much larger executive reviews, and then we did like mostly just a report out to everyone to say like, hey, here's what we've done, here's what we've learned, here's what we've launched. So it's more of like, it becomes more of an iterative cycle as opposed to a like big 3-month long planning cycle that never ends because it starts up again soon after that.
Yeah, no, I like that. And I think Danny was trying to, with the other vote, trying to get both out there, right?
Exactly.
Quarterly, but as needed.
Yeah, I think this is just in alignment with everything folks have said, but make sure it's a recurring, like at minimum, let's sit down and say, has anything changed? Do we need to update anything? If yes, and we've just been so busy, we haven't been able to do it, at least we have the scheduled time. If no, that's a really short meeting, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't mean you shouldn't, right? Like if something pops up, Chat GPT will use that as an example, right? January of last year, I bet you, 80%, I'm making that up. But a lot of companies probably had to say, oh shit, everything we just worked on in Q4 to establish these upcoming, 2023 goals and objectives out the window. Now our CEO is really, really like laser focused on this. That's changed. Now we have to change our work. So you wouldn't have wanted to wait until, Q2 or Q3 to do that. You'd want to do it as soon as, right, you got the meeting that was scheduled, or as soon as you started seeing all the newsletters coming out internally about how AI is going to take the business to the next level. That's to say, do it when it's appropriate, but at least have a set meeting there, so you're forced to make time for it.
So at a minimum quarterly, but also as you need it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Clay with the old-fashioned analog hand raise.
I thought it would recognize my hand and raise something. I'm wondering whether we'd be inclined to do more reviews if we felt like they were more valuable, or if everybody felt like they were more valuable. Employees and objective reviews.
For me, I'll separate OKR reviews from say employee, like, review type stuff. If you're doing a one-on-one properly as a manager and on the right frequency, I believe that you should be doing that. You're always sort of iterating the review and doing that. As an OKR, I think May mentioned monthly OKR check-ins or whatever it may be. I tend to agree with that. I think maybe it's in the value you make of it, and maybe it's also in a Lencioni death by meeting type concept. If the meeting's not adding value, let's not do it. But also let's realize there are certain types of meetings that we need to have, and we can do it that way. So, interesting point. I like that. Well, how would you vote on this, Clay?
In the poll?
Yeah.
Or my question?
No, in this poll, annual, quarterly, monthly, at whatever frequency.
Okay, once again, May swayed me. I originally said quarterly, but now I go with. Don't get too cocky, May.
No, she swayed me too.
The last one, which was the third one, I think, can't read it. Which is basically when new information. I had an old boss to say. What did he say? After more mature consideration, we have changed XYZ.
Yeah. No. Okay. Calvin, we're just gonna do rapid fire.
Yeah, I'm signing.
You're signing up with May?
I'm siding with May. I'm not signing up with them.
Okay, siding with May.
Yes.
Richard?
Mine was other. I focused on product objectives, and coming previously from the hardware space, where from your initial thought to getting something at the door is 12 to 18 months. If you're trying to revisit something like that too quickly, you're never getting to done. So you need to get something down. And
Elliot, Elliot, you were with May and us on the whatever frequency, right?
I was, though I do like the idea of a fallback. I'm sorry. I do like it.
So you're going with Danny now?
No, I'm in a hybrid model, but if it's as often as needed, though I like the idea of re-reviewing every quarter. Though, of course, Richard is now swaying me of every time you change it, it's so much effort, and then it just kind of restarts the clock at a bunch of things. So I'm just confused.
I think there's like different levels here, right? Like there is the need to review, there's the need to set your goals, but then there's like goals that shift commonly, and then there's like the big thing that really shouldn't change that much, because like your overall vision is generally pretty stable, right? Your general vision, you've got like a core strategy you're going to target, say like we believe that it's pretty easy to 4x our product because we haven't hit this specific market or whatever. So we need to build towards being able to do that. And that usually doesn't change very much, but like you might need to fix your support flow, fix your onboarding, increase acquisition, whatever that might be, right? So these are like little smaller objectives, and those shift over time. But like your overall like top level strategy like doesn't really change that often, right? Like it could shift a little bit. It could shift drastically if something huge in the market happens. But like there's different levels of things that change. So I think it's important to recognize like which level you're talking about. Yeah, they should be able to change whenever you need them to change. But like just.
But how do they hold you to a number then? I'm sorry, that was tongue in cheek.
The numbers happen. This is why the numbers happen at like a lower level. You've got like your core top level like North Star and the things, the main factors that impact the North Star, and you can like build a nice little dashboard or whatever to see how you're doing. But like at the end of the day, it's like what the teams do that really makes a difference.
It's making me think of Annie Duke's Thinking in Bets, and she talks about, we're going to make a decision with limited information, and we have to document that and understand it. And if we made that, we thought this was the right bet, and we thought that if it succeeded, it would create 18 million. I'll use Steve's number, right? But if we made the decision logically, with the right thought, with the right support, why should we be held accountable if, you know, there was unknown stuff that I don't know. I think she put some good stuff in there. I want to get Eric and Steve to be able to. Eric, where would you come down on this? Now that you've heard everybody argue for their own.
Well, I've kind of hinted I need the I'm with May t-shirt here, but to be more specific about it, I would have monthly outreach to a big piece of my GTM group and others, and I would speak quarterly, but we would adapt, and I would always try to trace back as best I could that we're not just going to willy-nilly shift. I wouldn't take them into, you know, Jira and AHA and show them all that granular stuff. I try to speak to my goals and I would bring them up to date, but I'd always try to document backwards to what I aspired to doing and then justify why we changed. Was it more learning about something once we released it, you know, and we decided to double down and do better? Or did we think that we had to stay on pace? And that's why we're going to come back around to this one of these days, you know, and we'll update you as soon as we can about that. So
no, I love that. Danny, and then I want to get Steve's opinion before we move on.
Yeah, I just wanted to go off of something that you just said, Eric. That documentation and communication of the why when things change gets missed a lot too. But that's so incredibly important for all of the business, all your cross-functional stakeholders and your individual teams to understand why. Oftentimes we don't get the why. And so we're like, what the hell? Like what, what's going on? Why are we throwing this out the window? Why is this now no longer important? And I feel like when people have the right level of information and the right context, it can help eliminate some of that pivot and shift friction that happens as well. But that's my 2 cents for what it's worth.
I appreciate that, Danny. That's great 2 cents. Actually, good 5 cents. That's an inside joke for Steve, Danny, and I. Clay, is it something quick? Because I want to move from this topic and give Steve a chance.
Telling why is a good opportunity to say, isn't it great that we changed and did this evaluation?
Yeah, no, I agree. Steve, any thoughts on this?
Well, you know, I was thinking about the cascading versus bidirectional communication. And I used to sit down with my team and basically ask them to give me a memo of things they were proud of this year, because I have no ability to remember. So if you haven't done anything for me in the last week, I don't remember what happened 53 weeks ago, right? And in many of those discussions, I would have a discussion about where do you want to be next year? Not just what I want you to do for me next year, but where do you want to be next year? And I had a number of occasions where people said, I want to learn a new skill. And as somebody pointed out earlier, I think it was Danny pointed out the need for professional development funding in order to get the professional development. And so, you know, as we think about these things being imposed upon us, we're also frequently doing the same thing on our people. So let's make that a bidirectional conversation. Well, you know, a conversation generally has, you know, at least 2 voices in it.
It should. And then that's, I think, goes back to what I was talking about earlier about potentially going down a tangent of this top-down, you know, objectives handed to you versus, you know, where we go in strategy when we talk about this idea of guide rails or boundary conditions that enable people to make the right decisions of what they should be doing. And I think that in the objective process, you know, it's interesting how similar the objective process and the strategy process are coming. Richard was talking about roadmaps, and maybe the reality is our objective should be about how are we individually helping achieve a strategy. What's our strategy to support the strategy? And these are parallel, totally aligned things. But I'm of the belief that, like strategy and objectives, we should be doing, okay, here are the boundary conditions. Here's our expectations. Here's what we're trying to do. In a bi-directional is the word you use, the term you use. You know, what with this being the case, I'd love to get your take on what you think they should be and how they think they should be. And that's tough sometimes, because if they're pushed down on us, that almost is a cultural thing that comes down from the top versus otherwise. And God, it gets me back to how, at least, back in my day, and I think it's still the case, how much of my income was based on these objectives, right? I had places where I had a 20 or 30, I think at some places I was 80-20, at some places I was 70-30 fixed for base versus bonus. And we've been talking about this process and how messed up it is and how they change things to have 20 or 30% of your income tied to a process like this. God, I never thought about it this way until this call. It just seems like it's messed up.
Well, I'm not to belabor the point here, but I do remember talking with various bosses through the years where they would kind of mandate my objectives. And, in particular, like, corporate objectives or even product revenue objectives, I'm like, there's not anything I can do to affect that. So thank you for the money, right?
Yeah.
But I would want my variable comp, if you will, to be driven largely by things I could control. And in particular, they said, well, Steve, we want to pay you a bonus on P&L. And I went, great. So now I will be able to reject contracts for excessive discounting. Thank you. And they're like, whoa, hang on. And I'm like, well, but you're okay with me outsourcing if we need additional development resources to get my product what it needs. And they're like, no. And I'm like, so why in the world am I being paid on P&L? Because I can't control the P or the L.
Yeah.
Thank you for your happiness, right?
One of
theater.
my biggest successes when I was at that really big conglomerate was the sales team was comped on top line, and my team's bonuses were based on operating income. And total dichotomy there, right? The salespeople just wanted to give money away to get deals. We were a distributor, so we didn't have a ton of margin to give away. And I actually taught my matrixed inside and outside sales leader finance, right? I helped them understand this and they actually went to their leadership and asked to be put on a 50-50, 50% top line, 50% bottom line for their commission. And that actually helped us improve our profitability by double digits. But that got me my bonus, but what did it really do? If we don't have alignment of stuff. What a great conversation. I wish we had time for some more questions, but we're going to have to go into our key takeaways. What's your biggest learning or takeaway from this conversation? I'm going to start with the Iron Sheik.
So it's more of a confirmation that everyone is still doing a horrible job at this and tying the difference between their strategy and their plan and the different questions that each one asks and how objectives tie into that. So good to know that I'm not the only one.
Yeah, sometimes it's just being able to wallow in the incompetence of all of our organizations, right?
Exactly.
We're not
Misery
alone.
and company.
Elliot Golden, go Birds.
Go Birds. It just completely confirmed for me that these processes are incredibly hard, and that's why we are compensated the way that we are, and that's why it's hard to succeed in this type of business. So I appreciate everyone's perspectives to move things forward.
Awesome. Thank you. Clay.
I think it's really important to illuminate and be clear on the value. So we want to do it more and get support.
All right. And maybe it's shifting the value of objectives versus the value of an annual process for reviewing people. I see that. Eric.
I like to say the takeaway that I'm hearing reinforced is we are very vulnerable in this kind of role for many reasons. And we've got a great opportunity, no matter how many Reforge artifacts are out there, no matter how many great podcast episodes there are, we've got an opportunity to do something about being so vulnerable that we haven't cracked yet. And I'm very passionate about working on that as a matter of fact.
I love that. Richard.
It highlights, right, change is happening around us at exponentially faster speeds, and we're all stuck in businesses that are very rigid and unmalleable. And we have to figure out the nooks and crannies to find our way through that maze.
I love that. I love it a lot. Calvin.
Yeah, so, a couple of things. One is kind of struck by the fact that some of the and this is something that Rick kind of alludes to about the rigidity. Organizations I've been a part of are oftentimes more slow to move because they're not software. It might be hardware or enterprise software, and really the need to make those changes in other organizations or other industries is much more. There's just more fluidity, and secondly, just realizing that some organizations, leaders don't always step into this void and have those conversations about the changes that are taking place, the changes, the ebbs and flows, and making adjustments throughout the year. That's just something that's needed.
Yeah, I'm sort of tracking on some of that myself, where I think I'm going to go. Danny.
I think I have two key takeaways. One is this is more of a widespread problem than I had hoped. And two, I feel very validated and confident in my approach over the years, which is to just be like a bull and go in and force leadership, like make it make sense. Like, why are we doing it this way? Does this really make sense for the business? If you hand us these types of, objectives and they change, what are we supposed to do? Right? How are we supposed to tell you when the original game plan is failing? How are we supposed to let you know that we have to course correct? And just kind of forcing people to sit down and think about that. It's not easy. Some people don't want to hear it, but it can be highly effective.
No, I love it. And sometimes you need a bull in the china shop to shake some stuff up. May.
Every time I've done something like this before, the other leaders want to talk to you. It's not like this is a thing that everyone's avoiding. It's the length of time away that makes it terrifying. So if you do it more often, it gets easier. Is there a way to call it something else to like reduce the stigma of alignment? Because this is an alignment problem. Everything we're talking about is not the actual objectives. It's the alignment issue. So how do we do that better? That's what I'm thinking
No,
about.
I completely and totally agree. My friend Steve.
Well, I think taking it maybe a little different direction, I think we need to do a better job of socializing success. That our teams have done good work, and I want to tell you their story. A customer had a good experience, and I want to tell you this story. One of my product managers had a good experience, and I want to tell you this story. And I think that we so often are the carriers of the no decision, right? And we don't, I think, do a good enough job of communicating our value. And I think that at least quarterly, you want to have that discussion with your team. What are you doing? What's blocking you? What are some places that I can help move you forward? Because moving you forward moves us all forward.
Yeah, you just shared a great Rich Mironov article on the merchandising of product management, which that sort of reminded me of, which I thought was a great one. Everybody should check it out. I think the big thing for me came from looking at annual reviews, and all this dysfunction we're seeing here is really just a symptom of other problems. I was talking in that product leader conversation I mentioned earlier. Somebody said in design, you're supposed to look at the next level up of context. So if you're designing a chair, you need to understand the room you're putting it in, right? If we don't fix our annual or our how we plan and strategize and determine what to do, how can we even come to anything on objectives, right? And it really shows that this issue we have with this balance between control and reporting and an annual thing versus agility in how it's failing, because we're not able to make these changes. And what we're seeing in annual objectives, I think, is just a symptom of that, and where it's going. And it's truly the root cause is this inability that, as you know, what was that? Unmalleable, is that the word that Richard was using? But you know, rigid, not changing. And if we can't do that, I don't think we're going to get to a place where we can make the change happen. So guys, thank you so much. People, everybody, thank you so much for what a wonderful conversation. Hopefully you guys got as much of this conversation as I did, even if it's making you feel like at least you're not alone. My mind's got so many things going right now. I'm always thinking when I come out of this. In 2 weeks, we will have our next topic of the week. And I've made this a recurring one. The last topic of the week that we do every year before the holiday is about product management in the real world, because I feel like thinking about product management in the real world, how we see it, helps people understand what product management is and the decisions we make. So we're going to be talking about where we see product management in the real world, and decisions we might change if we were product managers of things we use. That'll be the conversation in a couple weeks. And we do this in the community. Monday, the conversation will go, the question will go in. Wednesday, the poll, and on Friday, we'll have these amazing conversations. So thanks everybody for the wonderful insight and contributions, and we'll see you next week in the community. Have a great weekend, everybody.
Bye.